What is romance, and how does it relate to sexuality? It's been hard for me to find consensus on this topic. As a result, I have created a model attempting to describe the concept of romance. This video will be using a lot of terms from the asexual community that try to understand sexual and romantic attraction that I think could be of use to you regardless of your own personal sexual or romantic identity. The first term I'd like to talk about is the split attraction model. This is basically the concept that your sexual orientation can be separate from your romantic orientation. This is usually in terms of asexual and aromantic people. Some asexual people still experience romantic attraction, and some aromantic people still experience sexual attraction. An issue I've had with the split attraction model is that it can imply that romantic and sexual attraction are two discrete things. Even among those that believe them to be related, it seems hard for people to effectively compare and contrast the two. In this video, I aim to show the link between romance and sexuality. So first, let's talk about romance. I think of romance as a sort of spectrum. Now, there's already the concept of a romantic attraction spectrum in the asexual/aromantic community. This romantic attraction spectrum is used to describe how a person can be in between fully lacking romantic attraction and having what may be considered normal levels of romantic attraction. My romance spectrum model differs in that it's a two-dimensional spectrum, and neither of those dimensions are romantic attraction, like in the existing romantic attraction model. First and foremost, my romance spectrum model is a sort of conceptual proof of my definition of romance, which is that romance is the combination of love and sexuality. However, as you will see, it can also be used as a hypothetical framework to explain other terms from the asexual and aromantic communities. Let me show you what I mean. Here is my romance spectrum model. As you can see, sexuality is on the x-axis and love is on the y-axis. Everything in the colored portion represents romance. But before we talk about romance, I'd like to talk about the love and sexuality axes on their own. The sexuality axis doesn't necessarily represent one's level of sexual attraction, but rather the degree to which sexuality plays a role in one's romantic identity. Similarly, the love axis does not represent one's capacity for love, it represents how much love affects romantic identity. For sexuality specifically, there's likely a great degree of overlap between one's sexual attraction level and how much it affects one's romantic identity. More on that later. I also wanted to take a moment to define what I mean by love, because there are a lot of people that believe in multiple types of love or even use love and romance interchangeably. I only believe in one kind of love, and the way I define it is that love is caring and connection. While this definition may seem simple, if you're trying to find a definition of love that applies in all contexts, it would pretty much have to be simple. Now I'd like to talk about what love and sexuality look like in the context of this model when isolated. Let's think about what these black lines represent on our spectrum model. These are the points at which, for the x-axis, love equals 0, and for the y-axis, sexuality equals 0. Love without sexuality is platonic love, and it no longer describes romance because of how it's been defined in this model as a mixture of love and sexuality. So we can think of the vertical black line on its own as representing platonic love. For sexuality, I use the term raw sexuality to refer to sexuality without the presence of love. Like we talked about with platonic love, raw sexuality no longer describes romance because there's no love present, and so a horizontal line can be used to represent raw sexuality. With all that out of the way, I'd like to begin to map different sexual identities to our spectrum model. A lot of the following terms are taken from the asexual community, so you might not be familiar with them, but I will define them as we go. The first pair of terms I'd like to define are Alloromantic and Allosexual, and these just mean not aromantic and not asexual respectively. For example, allosexual would mean that you do experience sexual attraction. So, because our vertical line represents love without sexuality, and also without romance as previously explained, we could say that this line represents the aromantic asexual. Similarly, for our horizontal line that represents sexuality without love, we would also have aromantic, but allosexual this time. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is not to imply at all that aromantic allosexuals do not experience love. This just means that for them, love and sexuality do not intersect to form romantic attraction. If you want to think about it mathematically, If we say sexuality times love equals romance, sexuality times 0 would equal 0. Now that we've talked about aromantic asexuals and aromantic allosexuals, I'd like to discuss the two alloromantic orientations, alloromantic allosexual and alloromantic asexual. Now we finally get to the romance portion of the model. Remember how I said that the x-axis of our model does not necessarily indicate level of sexual attraction? That's going to be very important for what I'm about to say. As you've seen from the model as I've defined it, sexuality is needed for something to be considered romance. However, not everyone that experiences romantic attraction experiences sexual attraction. This would be a discrepancy if I believed romance and sexuality to be two completely different things, but I don't. I think of romance as being what I call informed by sexuality. I use this phrase specifically to talk about alloromantic asexuals. What it means is that while a person can experience no sexual attraction, it does not mean that they are devoid of the influence of sexuality entirely. While it might not manifest as sexual attraction proper, it is still enough of an influence to create romantic attraction. I know this might sound weird to a lot of people, so allow me to explain further. We are, by default, sexual organisms. Even among the most asexual people, it's a stretch to say that no sexual biological influence has ever affected them in some way. In other words, I'm describing the difference between the word asexual being used as a sexual orientation versus how it's used in terms of reproductive systems and biology. While people can, of course, be asexual in orientation, none of us are truly asexual in terms of our biology, aka how we reproduce. This is all to say that we don't fully understand all the ways in which our sexual systems affect us. It's a topic that's very interesting to me and one that I will definitely explore further on this channel. The influence of our sexual biology can have an impact on us and our romantic identities even if we do not experience sexual attraction. Hence the phrase, romance is informed by sexuality. To represent this in the model, I've created what I call the sexual attraction threshold. This is an arbitrary point along the sexuality dimension of the model, and it represents the boundary between sexual attraction and lack of sexual attraction. It can be thought of as the amount of sexual influence necessary for a person to experience sexual attraction. The area to the right of the sexual attraction threshold represents alloromantic allosexuals. To the left of the threshold are alloromantic asexuals, aka those who do not experience sexual attraction, but for whom sexuality's influence still manifests as romantic attraction. I'm using each identity's pride flag to show where they would go on the spectrum. If you're wondering why the alloromantic allosexual portion is grayed out, it's because alloromantic allosexuals do not have a pride flag. Now we can see all four of the identities that we've talked about represented on the model. Notice that these four identities together encompass every possible combination of romantic and sexual identity. Here's another term under the asexual/aromantic umbrella that can be neatly placed on our spectrum model. Alterous attraction is defined as a type of attraction that's in between romantic and platonic attraction. So, we could quite easily create another threshold at another arbitrary point in the alloromantic asexual portion of our spectrum, and say that this is the transition point between romantic attraction and alterous attraction. I think of alterous attraction as a subset of romantic attraction. In other words, I think alterous attraction is a type of romantic attraction. However, I would not define romantic attraction as a subset of sexual attraction. I say these thresholds are at arbitrary points because my romance spectrum model is not intended to be a proper graph. These thresholds could be at different places for different people, and regardless of their place, it doesn't mean, oh, I'm 20% sexual or 70% romantic, because what does that mean? The romance spectrum model merely serves as a visual representation of the concept of romance. The last pair of terms I'd like to map onto the model are demisexual and fraysexual. Demisexuals require an emotional connection in order to experience sexual attraction. Fraysexuals can be thought of as the opposite. In other words, if there's too much of an emotional connection, they are no longer sexually attracted to a given person. I'll be using another arbitrary threshold, this time on the love dimension of the model, that I call the emotional connection threshold. Demisexuality goes above this threshold, and fraysexuality goes below it. Earlier, I defined love as caring and connection. Since I believe the two to usually go hand in hand, our emotional connection threshold maps very neatly to the love dimension of the spectrum. Note that demisexuality definitionally involves both sexuality and connection/love. This means that demisexuality is inherently part of the romance spectrum due to the way it's been defined here. However, I have heard there are some people who identify as aromantic demisexual. I think this discrepancy can largely be explained by me potentially having a different idea of what attraction is than other people. The common definition of romantic attraction seems to be an emotion arising from the desire to have a romantic relationship or engage in what would be considered romantic touch with another person. However, our conception of what actions we do or do not consider romantic is a social construct. For example, there are some families where family members kiss each other on the lips. They don't consider it to be a romantic touch, but for those who do, it is often seen as weird or gross. Similarly, when a parent and child hold hands, it's not seen as romantic, but when two adults do it, it is generally considered romantic touch. So for the aromantic demisexual, it could be that they don't want the kind of relationship or touch that is considered romantic. Regardless, I believe them to be somewhere on the spectrum between aromantic and alloromantic, not fully aromantic. This is largely because I believe there is no essential difference between romantic and sexual attraction in terms of where they come from, assuming love has not been established. The difference lies more in what a person is compelled to do as a result of that attraction than the attraction itself. However, that's not to say that romantic and sexual attraction feel the same. I think the main differentiators between the two are the context in which the attraction is occurring and one's own personal sexuality and how it manifests. For example, let's say you just saw a stranger and you're attracted to them. There is no connection between you two save for maybe a basic connection that you would share with any human. This attraction isn't romantic in the sense that it doesn't involve love, but it could still make you want to pursue a romantic relationship with the person. I think this says more about your personal sexuality and maybe a bit about your social conditioning than it does about a genuine love for that person. I would categorize this conception of romantic attraction as really a type of sexual attraction, since there is no love involved. If we think of romantic attraction as love and sexual attraction combined, though, demisexuals must be alloromantic. This is why I've begun to think of demisexuality more as a romantic identity than a sexual one. A demisexual person could feel aromantic due to the way their own sexuality manifests itself, i.e. their attraction feeling more like a sexual attraction than a romantic one, or it could also be that said demisexual doesn't want the things that are typically involved with romantic relationships, such as commitment or romantic touch. I know that was a big tangent, but I really wanted to cover all my bases. One thing I hope you've taken away from what I've said about the concept of aromantic demisexuals is that I'm trying to create something that goes beyond just what an individual person is feeling. I seek to define a concept like romance more objectively so that it goes beyond one's own personal experience. My intent with this video isn't to tell you how to feel, but instead to hopefully give you more insight into where those feelings come from. Now, let's talk a little more about Fraysexuality. We said that demisexuality is a part of the romance spectrum because given its definition, it must involve both love and sexuality. However, Fraysexuality does not need to be a part of the spectrum. For example, what if there was a Fraysexual person for whom their emotional connection threshold is the same as the horizontal line representing raw sexuality, or sexuality without love? This would mean that any love whatsoever causes them to no longer be sexually attracted to a given person. That would also make this particular Fraysexual person an aromantic allosexual. A Fraysexual with an emotional connection threshold higher than this, though, would be at least a little bit on the romance spectrum. Okay, I think that's most of what I wanted to cover. If you have any questions, let me know. I would also like to know what your definition of romance is, and how you differentiate romance from love and romance from sexuality. Thank you for watching.